Story 1. I was not so much let in on it as I discovered it. My grandmother died when I was about 8 from lung cancer. I was at her bedside the day she died, and I remember her being bruised all over her face and arms. Years later, as an adult, that fact never sat right with me, so I obtained her medical records. It turned out she had been mugged while leaving the bank and was beaten to death by men after resisting. I understand why my family covered that up. Story 2. My grandmother left my grandfather and became pregnant. The man involved abandoned her. My grandfather took her back with the baby, and they had 2 children together after that. He treated her son the same as their 2 children. I did not learn any of this until my 50s. Story 3. I have a niece I did not know about until I was middle-aged. My oldest sister left home early when I was a child. It turned out she had become pregnant as a young teen and went to live with our grandmother to carry the pregnancy, give birth, and place the baby for adoption. I did not learn this for decades. During my divorce years later, my sister called and said she knew what it was like to have your life upended because of her daughter, which confused me. She had never had any other children, so I realized I had been really missing something. It turned out my sister thought our mother had told me once I was an adult, and our mother thought my sister had told me, so they both assumed I already knew when I had no idea. A few years later, her daughter finally reached out using information on file at the agency. She is now part of the extended family, and my sister is a bonus mom. They were both lucky the reunion went well. Story 4. My great-aunts were almost certainly a secret lesbian couple. They lived together their entire lives except for 1 year when one married. During that time, they cut off contact. After the divorce, they lived together until one of them died. They were observed together in ways that suggested a romantic relationship, and we believe it continued. They showed little interest in men. Even during the marriage, most people thought there was nothing between them. Story 5. My great-grandfather drank himself to death. My grandmother was ashamed of where she lived. He was the town drunk who spent most weekends in jail. She often had to carry him inside before school because he was passed out on the lawn. They finally told me when I started drinking a handle a day. Story 6. My grandpa used to call women he knew from his church and give them the heavy breathing treatment. He and my nan were quietly asked to leave town before the police were involved. Before I found out, I wondered why they had sold their house so cheaply and moved towns at 60 years old. Story 7. One of my cousins had a baby when she was 17. My aunt and uncle sent her out of state to a hospital, where she placed the baby for adoption. Years later, after the child turned 18, my uncle began searching and eventually found him. He was doing well and had a family of his own. My uncle did not contact him. He only told my aunt and my mother that the boy was fine. They decided my cousin did not need to know where he was, and she died not knowing what had become of him. I have no idea if any of her siblings ever knew she had given up a child when she was young. If they did, they never said anything. The only reason I know is that when I was going over my mother's will, I noticed she had this cousin listed as my guardian if anything happened to her before I turned 18. I asked why that cousin, and that is when the story came out. Story 8. I grew up in a Mennonite community. My mother had at least 4 children by other men, so there would be less inbreeding. I was one of them. Story 9. My father came home from school one day when he was 12 and saw his mother being taken away in an ambulance. She died that day. He never told us why or how. A few years ago, I saw her death certificate. The cause was self-induced abortion. Story 10. I learned that my father was the product of incest. My great-grandfather raped his own daughter, so the same man was both my father's father and his grandfather. I did not find out until my 20s. My father was already dead, and I had been disowned, so I could not talk to anyone about it. It is horrifying how many people are discovering dark family secrets from at-home deoxyribonucleic acid tests. Story 11. My much older cousin, a new mother, killed herself in my mother's bedroom during a family reunion. If my mother had not told her not to take the baby for a nap because he was not tired and had kept him downstairs, it is likely she would have killed him too. Story 12. When I was a kid, I attended a science day camp for a few weeks. We did various activities with teachers and volunteers, and one teacher's assistant stood out to me. We hit it off and had a great time every day. At pickup, the teacher joked to my father that the teacher's assistant and I acted like siblings. I remember my father seeming distracted for the rest of the day and into the following week. It turned out the teacher's assistant and I were actually half-siblings. We share the same father. A few years later, my father told me that when he was 18 or 19, he had unintentionally gotten his girlfriend pregnant. Both were devout Catholics, so she carried the pregnancy to term and then abandoned their daughter. With no other options, he placed the child for adoption. I have not seen my sister since. Part of me wants to reach out since I have that information, but I am nervous because we are both adults with our own lives now, and there is about a 16-year age gap. Story 13. My great-uncle's career was home robbery. His specialty was getting into second-story windows by climbing on objects below, so his nickname was Porch. Story 14. I thought my dad died of natural, heart-related problems more than 13 years ago. I was 19 at the time. I am 32 now. About a month ago, I found out that his death was an intentional suicide by pills and alcohol. They had not told me. As a side note, his funeral wishes were not respected. His mother, my grandmother, pushed for a very Catholic service and burial. My dad was an atheist and had been clear that he did not want a traditional religious funeral. He wanted to be cremated. He often made fun of religion and kept a flying spaghetti monster magnet on his fridge. It has always bothered me that someone's final wishes can be ignored, even by loved ones. Story 15. My paternal grandmother's last words to my father were that there is a big family secret about him. Then she was gone. That secret is probably lost forever. Story 16. My father's childhood was difficult. His mother spent a lot of time with sailors. He did not know his father. She appeared to be a prostitute. He slept in a bed with his siblings. One day they woke up and the baby was dead. His life changed when his grandmother, a force to be reckoned with, discovered the situation and took him to live with her. He found a loving home, received a good education, and began his chosen career. Story 17. Some members of my extended family, about 20 people, were executed in my parents' home country for violating certain laws. We have been told never to return because we fear being executed. Story 18. My father's side of the family employed domestic help until the 1970s. They employed a black woman who lived in a separate part of the house and did most of the cooking, cleaning, and babysitting for my father and his siblings. She was not allowed to eat with the family. Instead, she ate alone in a small room off the kitchen after the family finished their meal. After my grandparents died, my father gave her a portion of his inheritance so she would no longer have to work. It was not lavish but enough to live on. He also insisted that she be included in family events such as holidays and birthdays because he considered her family. I grew up thinking of her as a great aunt. Story 19. I learned that the woman I thought was my grandmother is actually my step-grandmother. My biological grandmother died a few years ago from substance abuse. On the other side of my family, my grandfather, whom I had always been fond of, was an alcoholic and quite abusive. That explains why neither of my parents drink. Story 20. For most of my childhood, I had no idea that my grandpa was a residential school survivor. Story 21. I did not find out that my parents' recorded date of marriage was wrong until my mother died, when I saw her death certificate. They had married on a different date. 3 days later, they were notified that the justice of the peace's license had expired, so they had to borrow money from my uncle to remarry. My mother was so horrified that she made my father and my uncle promise to keep silent. This happened in the early 1950s. Story 22. I thought growing up that my parents married and became pregnant with me quickly afterward. As a teen, I learned my mother accidentally became pregnant with me after their engagement, so they had to move the wedding earlier. When I was 17, my mother died by suicide. It was not until I was 24 that I asked my father the story again. He told me he had been trying to break up with my mother, but they were on and off, and she flushed her birth control pills down the toilet to force a pregnancy. Ultimately, they married because it was the right thing to do, but she went on to end her life and left my father to finish raising me. My father says he does not regret me one bit and loves me, but I cannot help wondering how differently life could have played out. Story 23. The first secret was that I had a cousin who had been given up for adoption. A few years later, while intoxicated, my aunt confided the reason she had given up her daughter and made me promise to keep it secret. The father of the child was her first cousin. Story 24. My stepfather did not die of a heart attack. He died from a failed attempt at autoerotic asphyxiation. Story 25. Just a standard 23andMe discovery of my biological father at 49 years old. The strangest part is going from being an only child to becoming part of a large family. Story 26. My great-grandfather was adopted by a mixed-race Baptist deacon who was also the local postmaster. It was significant because we took his name. It was doubly ironic because much of the older generation in the family was overtly racist while bearing his name. When I found his death certificate, which proved it, my father was stunned and my aunts were, too. I chuckled quietly under my breath. Story 27. My grandpa sat us all down in the living room one day and let it out. We weren't completely Polish, but partly Spanish. The only problem was that he was the only one who still cared. He was disappointed. Story 28. My aunt was sexually abused at 14 by a man in his 50s. My great-aunt sexually abused her son, and the authorities did not intervene while my mother and uncle were raised almost feral, with little education or literacy, forced to work and lacking adequate food. Story 29. My dad did not die of a virus that attacked his heart. He died snorting cocaine. The most striking moment was when my dad's oldest brother spoke candidly to me about the whole day and how much he misses him. He said they had been trying to get clean for the kids and our wives, and that a quarter bag was supposed to be the last time, but it did them in. Then he asked if I knew. Your mom didn't tell you? She was involved in that lifestyle with your dad too. I had no idea. She never told me that my dad died snorting cocaine with his older brother, or that she used with them. She had spared me those details. My mother was horrified that they told me when I was 15, 6 years after his death, and that she had used with my dad. I didn't know any of this, and it damaged my relationship with my mother. It took a long time to rebuild trust because of how I learned the truth. My uncle's actions caused a fallout that has not been repaired 18 years later. Some families never break that cycle and end up causing misery for others. Story 30. My great-great-grandfather shot his wife and her lover. The wife was injured and the lover died. He was not convicted. A newspaper called it justifiable homicide, saying she should not have been cheating on him. The same man rented his still to Al Capone during Prohibition to make moonshine. Police raided the still and arrested him. A newspaper article confirmed the events. He kept silent about who rented the still, and the mob paid him well for doing so. Story 31. My father's ex-wife died by suicide after learning that he had started a new relationship with another woman, my mother. By that time, they had already been separated. Story 32. When I was 22, I had to take a paternity test to determine whether my father was my biological father, because my mother had an affair around the time I was conceived. Story 33. My mother may have trapped my father. My aunt told me the day we scattered my mom's ashes. Story 34. This was in rural Canada in the 1930s. My relative had a girlfriend named Dulcie, and he was slow to propose. Since no one locked their doors then, she let herself in while he was out one night, pulled up the shades, took off her clothes, turned the lights on, and let the neighbors see her walking around his house naked. After that, he was forced to marry her. That is why no one in the family liked Dulcie. Story 35. My great-grandfather was gay. His best friend was actually his lover. One day he was supposed to be watching my mother while my grandmother and great-grandmother were out. They came home earlier than expected and found him with his lover. My mother was in another room and had no idea what was happening. A huge family uproar followed, and he had to stop seeing his lover, though it is suspected they continued to meet in secret. That unfortunately explains why my grandmother is so homophobic. My mother told me this after I came out to her. She was very supportive and not surprised, but she begged me not to tell my grandmother. Story 36. When I was 26, my grandfather had a heart attack and died a few hours later without waking. During the family drama, I learned he was not my biological grandfather. He had adopted my mother and aunt when they were very young after he returned from Korea. That never changed how I felt about him. He was my grandfather, and a few cells do not change the fact that he loved me and I loved him. I have now spent as much time without him as I did with him, and I still miss him. I hope one day to be half as good as he was. Story 37. My biological mother never wanted me and tried to kill me by starving and neglecting me. I was on the brink of death when my great-aunt and grandmother found me. After that, I was placed in foster care, but I was reunited a few years later. Everyone knew and kept it from me until someone brought it up during an argument, and I requested my Child Protective Services records. Story 38. My quiet, kind, straight-laced grandfather had a brother I did not know about. He mixed with the wrong crowd and became addicted to heroin. My grandfather sent him to rehab or whatever the equivalent was in early 1900s China, and he got clean but then relapsed because he still spent time with the same people. My grandfather said it was not hard to get clean and told him he would get hooked on heroin with him and then they would get clean together. That was insane. They went to rehab together, and after they were out, my grandfather made his brother join the Navy. He later died at sea. Story 39. My grandparents divorced, married other people and divorced them, then got back together and had another child but never remarried. I was scandalized when I was told this in the early 1980s. Things were still different then. Story 40. Oh, a juicy one. As I got older, I heard about a cousin who nearly married another cousin who was unknown to us at the time. They were engaged. Apparently his father had stepped out quite frequently in the 1960s, which led to questioning any relationship he entered within our shared race and community. More personal to me was that my father managed to sleep with my mother's twin within a year of their marriage. This came out in the 1950s, surprising everyone. A sad one I learned on a road trip in my preteen years. My mother and I were traveling, just chatting, and I asked her about the cousin I'm named after. My parents were older. My mother was 40 when she had me. This cousin, whose funeral I attended at the age of 5, was in his mid-20s. An amazing musician, I'm told. He struggled with mental health issues his whole life and didn't really seek treatment until the late 1970s. There was a big stigma. Hush, hush, you'll be fine. One night he called his parents, absolutely shattered, and said, "I'm so tired. I have Dad's revolver. Please talk me out of this." They didn't call him back until it was far too late. Story 41. It was a lot less dramatic than most of the others, but it surprised me. When I was about 5, my parents told me they had to fire my favorite babysitter because she had stolen money from my father. When I was a teenager, my mother told me that it was not money the babysitter had stolen but marijuana. Story 42. My great-grandmother killed a man with a shotgun. He may have been one of her employees. The family owned a cattle ranch, and the hands were not always the most well-adjusted. My great-grandfather financed the ranch purchase through a side hustle in bootlegging. He succeeded because my great-grandmother was a switchboard operator for the county. She listened to calls about law enforcement and tipped off her boyfriend if raids were planned. Story 43. My grandfather killed himself when I was 13. I could not understand why my grandmother was screaming at him in his open casket. Story 44. I have another sister living overseas. She only came out when she contacted me, and then everyone else came out of the woodwork to let me know. My cousins also have another sister. They were all in their 30s before she came out. Story 45. My maternal grandmother killed herself. My mother, who was 9 at the time, found her. She had used a rope that my mother had found and brought into the house earlier that week. My grandfather had died in a car accident a few years earlier, and I was told that my grandmother died of a broken heart. That may be true, but I did not know what that meant. Story 46. I did not realize that my mother had never been married to my father when she had my sister and me. I knew he had another family, a wife and children. As a child, I never thought deeply about it and assumed that at some point years earlier he and my mother had been officially together. But they never were. She told me over the phone during my junior year of college. It is strange the way the universe works. If my mother had not made an immoral choice by having a long-term relationship with a married man, and if he had not made an immoral choice by cheating on his wife, then neither my sister nor I would exist. Their two wrongs brought us into being. Story 47. My grandpa used to beat my grandma and his children. He was on drugs and hallucinated that someone was coming to kill him, so he pointed a gun at my uncle, who was about 15 at the time. It is so different from the grandpa I know now. At the mention of drugs, he shakes his head and says never to go near them. He hardly raises his hand to anyone, much less his voice, and he now lives a quiet life as a kind person. I was sure they were not talking about my grandpa when they first told me. Story 48. My great-aunt fled the United Kingdom in the 1960s after she murdered her first husband for sexually assaulting their daughter. My father cheated at least 3 times and has 7 children, rather than the 3 originally thought. He had a vasectomy after the youngest of us was conceived, because my mother caught him. Despite his severe transphobia and homophobia, 6 of those 7 children are gay or transgender in some way. The only cisgender heterosexual child is his oldest, who is currently 30 and lives in his basement, while his 2 younger legitimate children moved far away. Story 49. I always knew I was adopted as an infant. When I was 26, I received an anonymous letter in the mail containing my original birth certificate and a prayer card for my sister's funeral. I grew up knowing her as a cousin. Turns out my great-uncle adopted me. My aunt is my grandmother and my mother is my cousin. We visited my great-grandparents often when I was young. They lived about 4 hours away. My biological parents lived next to my grandparents, so I saw them regularly and played with my full brother and sister, but I did not have a clue. Story 50. My very distant relative went to fight in World War I with the personal goal of bringing back a German helmet. It was not until later that someone told me that when he brought it back, it was still occupied by its former owner. Story 51. My father had another daughter he did not tell my brother or me about. The truth came out after he died. My half-sister is awesome. Story 52. My father and his brothers each fathered at least 1 child outside marriage. I met a first cousin no one knew about through a DNA testing site. Story 53. My great-grandmother accidentally killed her younger brother when she was a toddler. My grandmother tried to abort my mother. One of our family friends was one of the girls who went away. There is a chance that one of my great-grandmothers cheated on her first husband with her second, my great-grandfather. I am still researching to learn the truth. Story 54. My grandmother was single in her 30s and was sleeping with a married man. Toward the end of her pregnancy, she met my step-grandfather. They married and put his name on the birth certificate. My aunt has always believed he is her biological father and, at 50, still believes that, even though every other person in the family knows the truth. My mother has about 10 siblings, so the sheer number of people who know the truth and have never told her is impressive. I have known since I was about 8. I am not sure why they trusted a child with that secret, but I never told. Story 55. My great-great-grandparents were not biologically related to us. They had been servants to a well-off family in Mexico and had kidnapped my great-grandmother from them, fleeing to the United States with supposedly stolen money and gold. This happened in the 1880s. I learned these details later. Even as a child, I knew people disliked the couple, and that she was the ringleader of the family because she was independently wealthy. That always stood out to me. What woman from Mexico in those days would have that much money while her husband had no say in anything? She owned half a block of houses that the freeway took in the 1950s. She also owned about 6 other properties around town that the family still lives in today. According to my grandparents, the trade-off for being given one of these homes was that she expected not only to name any child they had but to determine who they would marry. Arranged marriages. Evidently no one dared tell her to go to hell until my grandfather. And my grandmother, who was not her biological grandchild, did. That won my grandmother the title of the next dawn of the family when the older woman died. I could write a book about that nonsense. I witnessed some of it toward the end. She had a spine. It is crazy to think back how normal it all seemed. You did not think it odd as a child. Grown adults, sometimes older than she was, would come by and talk at the table about arrests, marriages, pregnancies, dating, abortions, and so on, asking my grandmother what they should do or for her blessing. It was wild. Story 56. We found out that my sister was biologically my half-sister. My dad had started dating my mom while she was already pregnant. They had not told us because they were worried we would treat her differently. I have always thought it was a wonderful thing. My parents had their problems, but they always loved us and each other. Not everyone can claim the same. Story 57. Not a skeleton in the closet, but here goes. My father was honorably discharged from the army because he lost the top of his middle finger in Vietnam. He always told my brother and me that it had been shot off by the enemy while he was giving them the finger. It was not until a few years after he passed away that our mother told us what had really happened. He was on laundry duty and one of the washing machines could spin while the door was open. My father was loading the washer while it was in motion when a pant leg wrapped around his finger and tore off the tip. My mother told him she would not ruin his fun by trying to make him out to be tougher than he was. Although embarrassing, I still think it makes a good story. Story 58. My great-aunt Lucille was the same woman B. King named his guitars after. Of course, no one has any hard proof, but she was wild even in her later years. I believe it. She was a hoot, and I still miss her. Story 59. My grandma had a brother who died when they were teenagers. Growing up, I only knew of him from a photo in her room. When I was a teenager, my younger sister died. That was when my grandma and I had a candid conversation about what happened to him and what those times were like for her. It was surreal because she was so open and honest about her experience with grief and losing a sibling, something she had never been comfortable talking about before. He died in an accident while my sister died from an asthma attack, but there were many similarities in our stories and how we both reacted. Both losses were sudden, unexpected, and terrible. She was the only family member who I felt really understood what I was going through, even while she was grieving her grandchild. She did not try to make my sister's death part of God's plan, and she did not tell me I would eventually get over it or that time heals all wounds. She told me point blank that I would grieve my sibling for the rest of my life, and that every major event from then on would be without her. While it would get easier, it would never be the same. She taught me more about grief than the therapist my family hired because it felt so real and raw coming from her. This conversation changed my understanding of her. For every birthday in our family, she thought of him. When her sons were born, when she adopted her daughter, when her children married, when she got married, when she got divorced, when my family had to move out of state, whenever anything happened in her life and he was not there. She never stopped thinking about him, missing him, and wishing she could tell him about all the good and bad things happening to her. We lost her toward the end of the coronavirus disease 2019 pandemic. Now I will grieve for her, my sister, and the great uncle I never got to meet for the rest of my life. Story 60. I discovered it was not only the verbal abuse that led my mother to leave my father. Around 1980, he started a hydroponic grow operation in the garage. My mother was so worried he would be arrested and we would be placed in child protective services that she finally left. He chose the grow operation and quick money over his wife and children. I learned this in my 40s and confirmed it. It was another example of his low-effort child support dodging and similar behavior. Story 61. My loving dad is not my biological father. They were teenagers, 16 to 18, and he knew she was pregnant by a man who skipped town. He wanted a family and loved my goth mother deeply. I look just like my mother, and my sister looks exactly like my father, so no questions were asked. When I found out from my grandmother, I loved my dad even more. For being an awesome dad. He has cared for me all his life and still does. I am 34. I am having a hard time medically. My muscles are wasting and I cannot walk well. I was in the emergency room for 6 days because my legs finally gave out. He came from another state and brought me a get-well basket of art supplies. I draw and went to college for design. Story 62. I learned a few years ago that my father has a cousin, possibly a second cousin. My father also had a great-aunt who was still living. When I asked why he never told us about them, He said it was because the great-aunt was a spirited racist and also the policyholder of my great-great-great-grandfather's inheritance. She died believing that my father never had children because if she had found out he had 3 biracial children, she would have cut him out of the inheritance and divided his portion among his cousin and his 2 siblings. His cousin is not a racist, but my dad says she is still a bitch, so he does not speak with her. My great-great-great-grandfather was a savvy businessman who became a millionaire, lost it all during the Great Depression, and then rebuilt his wealth with a barrel-making business. That said, I am not a millionaire, nor is my family. It is a long story. Story 63. My dear uncle died of the human immunodeficiency virus, not cancer. He had no contact with his parents or siblings until the late 1960s. He rebuilt his family ties, and that was a good thing except for his judgmental sister. Fuck you, Aunt Sue. Story 64. So my parents separated when I was about 4 because my dad was a piece of shit. I do not know the custody schedule. I just remember staying at his small camper sometimes. When I was there, women came for a few minutes, all sat in the same chair, and gave him money. Several were really pretty and wore giant hoop earrings, which led me to believe that giant hoop earrings were the epitome of class, grace, and refinement. My mother told me when I was an adult that my dad was a pimp, that those women were prostitutes he supplied crack to, and I had been very misled about what refinement looked like. One of those girls was 14. Coincidentally, I was also 14 when he died. Story 65. My great-uncle was an itinerant wild card. He lived on a houseboat and docked wherever. One time he came home and found his wife sleeping with another man. He threw all her things into the water, undocked, and left. He was a World War II veteran and had a hula girl tattoo that he would make dance for us when we were children. He also blew cigarette smoke out of his nose, which amazed me. He told us it was because he was part dragon. Story 66. It wasn't exactly hidden. We just never talked about it. My slightly older cousin, whom I looked up to as a kid and learned all the coolest things from, molested my little sister. Our grandma caught him and never did anything. My sister told me a little over 10 years ago, and I feel sick every time I think about him. Came up again just after she died in April, when my mom asked me about it. My sister's alcoholism had her saying and believing things that weren't real, so I confirmed what happened, which wrecked my mom. We don't associate with him anyway. He's a weirdo and lives in another state. I hated that my grandma made me go hug him at her wake. My grandma praises him as if he is doing more than any regular man to get by. She talks about how good his job is, how he does not live with his parents, that he has a car which she bought and he promised to pay her back for but did not, and that he rents a cute little home. I am sure he asks her for cash and rarely visits, like his mom and sister. Sorry for the ramble. I get angry when I think about my grandma not doing anything, not even disciplining him or acknowledging what she saw, whenever she starts to brag about him. Story 67. My great-aunt killed herself. She stuck her head in the oven while the family was out. I never even knew I had a great-aunt because she died in her early teens. Nobody had ever mentioned her, and I was firmly told never to bring her up. I asked my mother about her, since I was sure she would know at least a little, and all she said was that she was crazy. As someone living with depression at the time, I couldn't help but wonder whether I was crazy too, and what qualified as crazy to her immediate family. Hers was a staunchly Catholic immigrant family, and they essentially scrubbed her from history. All photos were destroyed. Her grave was separate from everyone else's, and nobody ever spoke of her again. By the time I learned she existed, my family was in the midst of an ongoing, decades-long mental health crisis affecting multiple members. From uncles to siblings, depression, anxiety, and addiction were pervasive. It turns out we did not come up with that ourselves in the 1990s. It had been there a long time. Story 68. My uncle's murder was suspected to have been set up by my aunt's ex-husband. Story 69. My grandfather killed a man and got away with it by buying off the judge. Story 70. I often wondered why my father's uncles and cousins were wealthy while we were not. Years after my father died, my mother told us that my grandfather had a gambling addiction and squandered much of his inheritance. Story 71. I always knew my father cheated on my mother and left to be with the other woman. He later married her and they had 4 children. I have met them. They are nice and we get along okay. However, I did not realize until much later that the oldest half-sibling is 2 months older than I am. Story 72. I had a cousin whom no one ever talked about. I only discovered her when we moved. While moving boxes, I found a picture. I asked my mother who she was. She said she was a cousin but refused to say more. A few years later, my aunt told me the backstory, which took place in the 1950s in the Deep South. My cousin was a nun and she became pregnant. As if that were not scandalous enough, the baby was mixed race. This was a time and place where that was not accepted. She was not allowed to remain a nun, and my family shunned her. I do not agree with how my family treated my cousin and her child. There is no excuse for the racism and sexism. I tried to learn more about my cousin but failed because my family was not forthcoming. It is sad. Story 73. One grandparent's family was heavily involved with organized crime, and I apparently still have distant cousins who remain connected to it. Story 74. One of my aunts told me I was named after one of my father's ex-girlfriends because my mother planned to give me a very ugly name he hated. So he filled out my birth certificate while she was still under general anesthesia after I was born by cesarean section. I am very grateful to my father. Laughing out loud. She spent the rest of her life mad about my name, but at least she did not know where he got it. The name was moderately popular back then. By the way, I do not know when or if they stopped using general anesthesia for childbirth, but I am glad my mother was both okay and not awake when my father named me. Story 75. On her deathbed, my grandmother confessed to my uncle that my grandfather, on his deathbed, had purposely overdosed on morphine at a time and place when physician-assisted suicide was not an option. She made my uncle swear not to tell anyone until after she passed. When she died, my uncle told the family. We were all shocked. That did not need to be a deathbed secret. He was very sick and terminal, and we all supported physician-assisted suicide. I do not know whether she carried that as a weight over the years. She outlived him by decades. I miss her and wish I had gotten to know her better. Story 76. A backwards hidden story. My great-uncle told me about his uncle, who had been shot to death by an angry husband while he was having breakfast with that man's wife. My great-uncle recalled that the newspaper was hidden from him when he was young. I later found that newspaper article and discovered that my ancestor had been eating dinner with a woman and a couple of other people when a man ran in, shot him, then ran out and killed himself. The case was straightforward. The shooter was jealous and mentally unstable. So the actual story, while tragic, was not as scandalous as it had been made out to be. Story 77. My mother used to keep many secrets. She often spoke of her brother who served in the United States Army Air Forces during World War II. He returned and went back to work on the railroad, but became terribly ill within a few years, which, she said, mystified the doctors and everyone. When my mother died, her younger sister told me matter-of-factly that their brother had drunk himself to death. My mother had also been married before my father, a fact she never mentioned until my brother visited a relative who told him. My brother thought he could use that against her, but she refused and told the rest of us. Apparently he had been in the Navy but went absent without leave, which I think was grounds for divorce during the war. Story 78. I knew I was adopted. I was 10 when it happened. When I turned 21, my adoptive mother gave me my adoption files, which shed a great deal of light. I don't know how, maybe because it was the 1990s and the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act was less strict, but I ended up with my birth father's confidential therapist notes from his counseling sessions. I had always wondered why he was so angry, the details of abuse, neglect, and his internal struggle with being gay in a world that would not accept him changed how I see him. I wish so badly that, even if he had lost all his children, he would not have killed himself and would have lived to see today. Who knows who he might have become, what happiness he could have found, and how his anger could have transformed. I feel guilty for reading those files, but I did not know what they were until I opened them. There are so many complex feelings from that stack of papers. Story 79. My aunt made her daughter lie to the police, claiming her father was assaulting her, so the aunt could get sole custody of the children and a quick divorce without the high legal fees. That is not even the worst thing someone in my family has done. Story 80. It wasn't a secret hidden from me. It was a secret I kept until my children were old enough to understand the gravity of the situation. When asked where Daddy went, I always said he got in trouble and was in adult timeout. I divorced him, remarried a truly amazing man, and could not be happier. My ex is still in prison. That poor girl is still just as gone. Story 81. I found out the man I thought was my grandfather was not my biological grandfather after seeing his obituary online. I have not spoken to any family members in almost 30 years, but every couple of years I look them up to see if anyone has died. It turns out my mother's mother divorced and remarried, and her new husband had 3 children I had never met. Story 82. I found out my mother had been raped by a family member after it came to light that I had been repeatedly sexually abused by my older brother when I was a child. Story 83. My cousin's stepson was convicted of murder. My cousin's side insists he is innocent, but my side thinks he is extremely guilty. Story 84. My great-aunt and uncle met at a Ku Klux Klan rally in Kansas in the 1930s. Story 85. I have never met a single person from my mom's side of the family. My parents moved from the Midwest to California when they were 18 and 20. I'm not 100% sure how they met, but I know my mom's family were textbook narcissists who were very poor. Because of that, they took their frustrations out on their children. My mom has 2 siblings, and I do not even know their names. Both of them turned out like their parents and stayed in close contact. The story was drip-fed to me over the years. A couple of years ago, I was shown a bunch of letters from my mom's parents that confirmed what my mom had told me. They referred to my mom as the whore of Babylon, a witch so repugnant Satan would not accept her, a cesspit of hatred that God could not forgive no matter how hard he tried, and so on. My mom is an amazing person, one of the kindest and most understanding people I have ever known in my 24 years. Her parents threatened her all the time. They were alcoholics, extremely religious without being involved in a cult, and they would leverage housing and food over my mom's head. They gossiped to everyone they knew about how terrible she was, even when she was a preteen. My parents moved to California as soon as possible and got married soon after. My dad tried to become a pilot but ended up as an air traffic controller because he could not afford the schooling fees while helping my mom get a paralegal degree. They built a life together based on mutual respect and love. They lived in California for almost a decade and made great memories before moving to Indiana for my dad's job. They adopted my brother soon after and had me 8 years later. Eventually, we moved to Texas when I was a child, the opposite side of the country, mainly because of my dad's job. I am certain my mom's shoulders eased up being that far from her family. I remember asking a few times why I only had one set of grandparents but always being told by my mom, "I'll tell you when you're older." Because of how she raised me, I respected that. I wasn't going to pry for information she clearly was not ready to divulge. When I was 16, my mom walked into my room with an expression I still cannot describe other than fear and sadness. She was holding a tiny Harbor Freight toolbox and told me it was from her dad. She said her dad had sent one to both me and my brother with no note. I learned 2 years ago the note was a worthless guilt trip toward my mom. The toolbox was a janky $15 box you would buy for a 10-year-old. She also mentioned he was going into liver failure and that this was probably a last attempt to make up for what he had done. She asked if I wanted the toolbox or wanted to reach out and connect with her dad. It was a no-brainer for me. "No, Mom. I have never met them for a reason and I trust your judgment," I said. She had never steered me wrong and I had no reason to doubt her decision. I will never forget how her expression changed. In that moment I could tell she was proud of how she raised me. She was proud that she raised a man with good values and a compassionate heart who would not step on her for useless information or closure for a door that was never open in the first place. My mom still talks to her aunt, but I have never met her. They are on good terms from what I know. But my mom has always been vigilant to keep me away from anything of her past. She is a good mom. Funnily enough, I learned about a year ago that when I traveled to see my dad's parents once or twice a year, My mom's family was only about a 15-minute drive away. I had been going to my grandparents' house for years and never once encountered my mom's family. That further solidified for me that they were crazy. Not a single person I knew told her family that I was there. It is 4 a.m. and I am wine drunk, but it felt good to type this all out. I may never know the specifics of what went on in the house where my mom was raised, but I know she did everything in her power to avoid raising us the way she was raised. She overcame adversity and a monstrous past. In 24 years, I have not met a single person from it. She shielded me from her mom, her dad, her two brothers, and extended family, all of whom had bought into the idea that my mom was worse than the devil. My parents now live in a gated retirement community in Texas. My dad is 61 years old and my mom is 59 years old. They are still just as in love as when they flew to California. There is a golf course in front of their house and they have enough money in the bank to enjoy retirement comfortably despite my dad's retirement account being stolen by the government. Nothing lavish, but my parents have never been into the high life. They have always pursued just enough to be comfortable. I am proud of my mom and I have told her that. She knows how grateful I am for her protection. On the rare occasion the topic comes up, I am quick to remind her. She was once an innocent child who carried an unjust burden, and she was able to thrive after getting away from it. She is awesome and I am proud to call her my mom. Story 86. I was an accident. They used protection but it didn't work. Mom, we always planned on having you, but not at that moment. You just came early. Me. Dad came early. I had no say in it. Telling me when I was an adult allowed me to get away with that retort. Thanks, Mom. Story 87. I used to think my mom's family was normal until I was old enough to understand. My mom was sexually assaulted by her brother, which is why we never spent much time with his family. My maternal grandfather has a brother. They have been estranged for 35 years because that brother tried to intervene in the grandfather's child abuse and domestic violence. Another maternal uncle, who is now a dedicated family man, was an alcoholic for a long time. Looking back at his wedding photos, it is obvious he was not drinking. My dad abused my mom and is an awful person. Story 88. The amount of adultery I have learned about involving deceased relatives in the past year is unreal. Story 89. The whole family knew Santa was not real and kept that from me for 24 years. Story 90. I found out about 7 months ago that the man listed as my father on my birth certificate is not my biological father. My biological mother refuses to tell me who he is. I do not know why she and the man I grew up calling my father would lie for so long. I was adopted at birth and have known my biological family, but I am 26 and I just want to know my medical history. I am so angry and hurt. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.